We are taught to fear the enemies we can see. Those who come with fire and steel, their intentions clear, their faces twisted by hatred. Against them, we build walls and forge weapons. But what if the most terrifying enemy in human history was one you could not see? An enemy with no face, no voice, no shadow. It is born not from malice, but from our own pride. From the arrogant belief that we have conquered nature itself, that we have tamed its most secret and powerful forces to do our bidding. In the 20th century, humanity made a pact with the atom, the very engine of the stars. We built temples of concrete and steel to house this new god, and for a time, we believed we held it in chains. We called these places nuclear power plants, and they were symbols of our ultimate triumph over the elements. But on one fateful April night, in the heart of a sleeping nation, we learned the terrible cost of our hubris. That was the night we discovered that the cruelest enemy is the one you cannot see, hear, or feel until it is far too late. This is not a story of fictional monsters. This is a story of real people, of heroes who walked unknowingly into their graves, of a system that valued secrecy over life, and of a radioactive ghost whose poison will haunt the earth for thousands of years. This is the story of the night the atom broke its chains, a night that began like any other, but would change the world forever. April 25, 1986. The Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant, Chernobyl, a source of immense pride for the Soviet Union, a sprawling complex teeming with life and energy. Unit 4 was scheduled for a routine maintenance shutdown, but before powering it down, the plant's directors decided to run an experiment. On paper, its purpose was noble, a safety test. The engineers wanted to see if the spinning turbine, after the steam was cut off, could generate enough residual electricity to power the reactor's cooling pumps for one critical minute, the gap before the emergency diesel generators kicked in. The terrible irony is that this test of safety would become the trigger for the greatest nuclear disaster in history. The night shift was exhausted. The experiment had been delayed for hours at the request of the Kiev energy controller. In the control room of Unit 4, a concrete bunker filled with the hum of machinery, the atmosphere was tense. The man in charge, Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, was a difficult, authoritarian figure, a product of a system that demanded results, not excuses. He pushed his young operators, Alexander Akimov and Leonid Topchinov, to proceed, dismissing their concerns. To begin the test, they needed to reduce the reactor's power. But due to an operator error, the power plummeted to almost zero. The reactor entered a state known as iodine poisoning, becoming dangerously unstable. According to every safety protocol, the reactor should have been shut down immediately. But Dyatlov, under pressure and blinded by ambition, refused. "Continue," he ordered. He forced the operators to take a fatal, unprecedented step. They pulled out nearly all of the graphite control rods, the very devices that slow the nuclear reaction. It was like removing the brakes from a train hurtling downhill. The reactor was now a wild beast, barely restrained. To prevent it from shutting down automatically, they manually disabled crucial safety systems, one by one. The operators saw the warning signs on their consoles, but they were too afraid to disobey. Step by step, they walked the atomic giant to the edge of a cliff. At 1:23 and 47 seconds in the morning, seeing the situation spiral completely out of control, Alexander Akimov activated the emergency shutdown button, known as AZ-5. It was the last rational act. This command should have driven all 211 control rods back into the core, killing the reaction instantly. But due to a fatal design flaw in the RBMK reactor, a flaw the designers knew about but had concealed, it did the exact opposite. For a split second, the graphite tips of the rods displaced water, causing a massive, instantaneous power surge. In the seconds that followed, the reactor's power level spiked to over 100 times its normal output. The first explosion was steam. The immense pressure ruptured the fuel channels and blew the 2,000-ton steel plate that covered the reactor core, a lid nicknamed Elena, straight up into the air. In that moment, pump operator Valery Kodymchuk was instantly vaporized, his body forever entombed within the ruins of the reactor. Seconds later, a second, far more powerful explosion tore the building apart. This was a chemical blast, as superheated steam reacted with zirconium to create hydrogen gas, which then ignited upon contact with the air. It was this explosion that sent a column of fire, smoke, and radioactive debris, pieces of the reactor core itself, a kilometer into the night sky. The heart of the reactor was now exposed, breathing its poison into the atmosphere. Workers who ran outside witnessed a sight that defied reality. Rising from the ruins was a column of light. Not fire, but a strange, ethereal, blue-white glow that pierced the smoke and reached for the heavens. This was no miracle. It was the air itself, being ionized by a stream of radiation so powerful that it became visible. It was the beautiful, deadly breath of an open reactor. Anyone who stared at that light was receiving a fatal dose. But they didn't know it. They were mesmerized by the ghostly fire, watching as if it were the northern lights, while an invisible inferno was burning their very cells apart. At 1:28 a.m., the fire alarm rang in the city of Pripyat, a fire at the nuclear plant. Within minutes, the first trucks were racing toward the disaster. These were ordinary firefighters, young men led by 23-year-old Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik. They were told they were going to a simple roof fire on a non-nuclear part of the facility. No one told them they were driving into the mouth of a nuclear volcano. Their only protection was a canvas coat, a helmet, and thin leather gloves. They had no dosimeters, no iodine pills, no knowledge of the enemy they were about to face. When they arrived, they were met with a scene from hell. The roof of the turbine hall was ablaze, and the ground was littered with strange, dark chunks of material. It was graphite from the reactor core. A single piece was radioactive enough to kill a man in under an hour. Firefighter Vasily Ignatenko picked one up, thinking it was just a piece of rubble. His hand would later swell and blister beyond recognition. They did their job with incredible bravery. They climbed the fire escapes, dragged heavy hoses, and poured water onto the fires, not knowing that pouring water on a nuclear fire was like pouring gasoline on a regular one. One would later recall, the bitumen on the roof was melting. It stuck to our boots. The heat was unbearable, and we tasted metal in our mouths. They inhaled radioactive smoke. Their skin absorbed the deadly dust. Within 30 minutes, the first symptoms appeared: uncontrollable vomiting, violent headaches, weakness. Their skin turned a dark crimson color, a so-called nuclear tan. They were the first heroes of Chernobyl and the first to die. Of the 28 firefighters who fought the initial blaze, all would die an agonizing death from acute radiation syndrome in the coming weeks. While these men were dying, the city of Pripyat, home to 50,000 people, was asleep. A young, vibrant city built as a Soviet utopia for the plant's workers and their families. Above them, an invisible cloud of radioactive iodine, strontium, and cesium was beginning to spread. The next morning, April 26th, the city awoke to a beautiful spring day. The sun was shining. Children went out to play, 16 weddings took place, fishermen sat by the river. People saw the smoke at the plant, but assumed it was a normal industrial incident. But the air tasted strange, like metal. Some felt a tickle in their throats, and their eyes watered. They saw strange sights: military vehicles washing the streets with a white, foamy liquid, and soldiers in strange masks taking readings with clicking devices. Yet, the official announcement on the local radio was calm and deceitful. The radiation situation is stable. We advise you to stay indoors and keep your windows closed. This was a lie designed to prevent panic. While the government in Moscow debated what to do, children were playing in sandboxes, breathing in radioactive dust. Mothers pushed strollers past soldiers in chemical protection gear. The city was living its last normal day, completely unaware that it was being bathed in a lethal shower of radiation hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb at Hiroshima. Once the military understood the horrifying scale of the disaster, a desperate operation began. They had to cover the open, burning reactor core to smother the fire and stop the release of radiation. Dozens of helicopters began flying missions directly over the glowing crater. The pilots were heroes. They flew into clouds of radiation so intense it was measured in thousands of Röntgen per hour, a fatal dose in minutes. The heat rising from the core threw the heavy helicopters around in the air. From their open doors, young soldiers, with minimal protection, kicked out bags of sand, clay, lead, and boron. Over 2 weeks, they dropped 5,000 tons of material into the reactor's throat. Several helicopters were lost, crashing into the reactor after their electronics failed or they hit debris. Their sacrifice was kept secret for years. Meanwhile, the radioactive cloud began to fall back to Earth. In nearby villages, a strange, black rain began to fall, leaving greasy spots on the ground. Children splashed in the radioactive puddles. Finally, 36 hours after the explosion, the government decided to act. On the afternoon of April 27th, the radio announcement came: a temporary evacuation was necessary. A fleet of over 1,000 buses, summoned from all over the region, lined up outside the city. The instructions were simple and chilling. Take only your documents and essential belongings. You will return in 3 days. No one ever returned. In a few short hours, people abandoned their entire lives. They left toys on the floors, food on the tables, photos in their albums. Pets were forbidden. Dogs ran after the buses, barking and crying, left behind to their fate. By 5 p.m., Pripyat was empty. It became a ghost town, a silent, radioactive monument to the tragedy. While Pripyat was being emptied, the Soviet government was lying to the world. They only admitted the truth after a nuclear plant in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away, detected high levels of radiation and traced it back to Ukraine. The pinnacle of this criminal deception occurred in Kiev, just 100 kilometers south of Chernobyl. The government, terrified of causing a panic, ordered the annual May Day parade to go forward as planned. On May 1st, hundreds of thousands of people, including scores of children in school uniforms, marched through the streets, waving flags directly under the invisible radioactive cloud that had drifted south. They were smiling for the cameras while breathing in poison. To clean up the disaster, the Soviet Union mobilized an army of over 600,000 people, known as liquidators. Soldiers, miners, engineers, and scientists were sent into the most contaminated place on Earth. They were called biorobots, sent to do jobs in areas where machines failed from the intense radiation. They ran onto the roof of the plant for 90 seconds at a time to throw chunks of radioactive graphite back into the reactor. Coal miners from Tula dug a tunnel underneath the molten core to prevent a second, even larger steam explosion. They worked in unbelievable heat and radiation, saving Europe from a far worse fate, but paid for it with their health and their lives. Many died in the years that followed, buried in lead-sealed coffins to contain the radiation from their own bodies. Chernobyl is more than the story of an accident. It is a story of incredible heroism and criminal silence. Of firefighters who walked into a nuclear furnace to save a world that didn't even know it was in danger. Of pilots who flew over a volcano. Of liquidators who sacrificed themselves to contain a threat they could not see. And it is the story of a political system that valued its own image more than the lives of its citizens. Today, a colossal steel structure, the new safe confinement, stands over the ruins of Unit 4, a monument to both human folly and ingenuity. Pripyat is slowly being swallowed by the forest, a haunting memorial to a lost world. But the radiation remains, a poison that will endure for 24,000 years. The memory of this catastrophe must also endure, because history, when forgotten, has a terrible habit of repeating itself. In our quest for power, we learned how to split the atom, but we still haven't learned to bear the responsibility for that awesome power. And that is the final, chilling lesson of Chernobyl. Thank you for listening. To hear more stories about the events that shaped our world, please subscribe to the channel. There are many more rare and little-known histories to uncover.